If a government wanted to create a housing crisis in a town, what would it do? This is a difficult question, but in County Kerry, we may have found our answer. With a population of around 14,000 people, Killarney has a good claim to be Ireland's pound-for-pound tourism capital, boasting some 4,000 tourism beds. Located next to the beautiful lakes of Killarney and Ireland's highest mountain, Carrauntoohil, the town is popular with tourists from all over, not least Americans, for whom the stars and stripes are frequently on display. Like many towns and cities in Ireland, Killarney has an acute housing shortage. As of this recording, a browse on property website Daft reveals just 2 places to rent in the whole town, neither of which is cheap. For those wishing to buy, things don't get much better. No sooner are properties listed before they are bid up and snapped up, with a seemingly endless supply of cash buyers making things harder for those with a mortgage. The solution would seem pretty simple: build more homes. After all, Kerry is Ireland's 4th least densely populated county, with plenty of room for building. Surely it can't be that difficult. Unfortunately, it's not that simple, as the following case shows. In May 2017, plans were submitted to Kerry County Council by a development company to build 228 homes adjacent to the town, on a site nestled by the Port Road. The development consisted of 76 houses, 152 apartments and a creche. The proposed site is situated close to Killarney National Park, but on the opposite side of the road, within the town's existing urban footprint. After some over and back with Kerry County Council, in December 2018, the developers stated their intention to avail of the new Strategic Housing Development Scheme, or SHD, which allowed developers to bypass local planning authorities for large-scale residential projects and apply directly to the National Planning Board, An Bord Pleanála, with a view to speeding up the process. In December 2020, the formal SHD application was received by An Bord Pleanála. Over the course of 2021, various meetings were held to discuss design, drainage and local ecology, and in December the council sent their letter of consent, subject to road upgrades, and this was followed in February 2022 with an approval letter from Irish Water. The following month, in March 2022, concerned residents met Killarney councillors to raise objections to development before creating a GoFundMe to hire a solicitor to appeal the application. Despite the pushback from residents, in May 2022, Kerry County Council indicated its support for the development, citing the town's chronic lack of housing, even though this was an SHD that would ultimately be decided by An Bord Pleanála. 2 months later, in July, An Bord Pleanála's inspector recommended that planning be refused, and in August the board sided with the inspector and refused permission. On the face of it, the development seems to have had a strong case for approval. Firstly, the Irish government's national development plans have been actively promoting developments in or near existing urban areas to promote compact living and not have people dotted all around the countryside. It is very difficult to obtain planning permission in Kerry for standalone rural developments, which strengthens the case for a more permissive approach to developments like this. Next, we have the fact that Kerry County Council gave it the green light, which indicates local democratic support. Next is the fact that Killarney was designated a rent pressure zone, which means that rents are so high that the government controls them. Controlling rents is a controversial policy among economists, as it can reduce supply. This is a topic we covered in a previous video, but regardless of one's views on rent controls, the fact that the government introduced them in Killarney is an indicator of housing pressures in the town. Finally, 4 months prior to the decision, Killarney began welcoming the first of its 3,000 Ukrainian refugees. Killarney was chosen due to its large hotel capacity, which lay largely vacant due to COVID, but use of the hotels was intended to be only a temporary measure. Increasing a town's population so significantly could only increase long-term housing pressure, especially as landlords receive tax-free treatment for renting to migrants, which is not available for locals. But just because a town needs housing doesn't mean that every development should be approved. That comes down to the specifics of each case. When the plans were submitted, some of the objections included proposed building heights and density are out of character with the area, impact on other flora and fauna, reference to black bees, potential for increased litter in the area, negative impact from those using the creche, proposed development could impact area's water table and impact tree growth. The inspector's report stated that the site is a prime example of where increased density should be encouraged, and it would have minimal impact on existing units and on their associated amenity spaces. In the end, the sole reason given for the refusal was that The proposed development may result in increased artificial lighting generated at both construction and operational phases that may impact on lesser horseshoe bats that commute along routes to the west of the Port Road and Dena River. This is the proposed site. This is the Port Road, and along here under the tree cover is the Dena River. The bats are said to be commuting along here to the west and may be disturbed by the new development, which is on the opposite side of the trees, the road, and beyond an existing row of houses. The lesser horseshoe bat is not endangered, and conservationists generally regard the bat's numbers to be stable or slowly increasing. And as per the board's report, overall bat activity was considered to be low. The board's decision seems to have hinged on a letter from the Development Applications Unit in the Department of Housing and Local Government sent in April, stating that the department recommends that An Bord Pleanála refuses to grant permission to the proposed development. Although a survey of commuting bats was carried out, what is required is documentation of where the bats precisely commute. A competent bat worker experienced in surveying lesser horseshoe bats is recommended for any surveys to be carried out. An Bord Pleanála is supposed to be an independent body, and a letter from the department does not automatically translate into a refusal, but in this case the letter looks to have been decisive. As a follow-up to the decision, local newspaper the Killarney Advertiser surveyed readers, and 75.4% of respondents disagreed with the decision. The paper's social media page attracted some amusing comments. I have a relatively new build in Glenflesk. The bats come out at night, swoop and dive around the house, having a field day. No doubt with the insects drawn by the light, they don't bother me, I don't bother them, we coexist just fine. Interestingly, the local residents association was quoted as saying, "This is a smokescreen. The reason for refusal is very weak and provides an easy avenue for the developer to appeal. For the main objectors to criticise a refusal is unusual. But smokescreen or not, over 2 years later the decision still stands. Depending on one's perspective, this case will provoke a different reaction. The developer's countless impact assessments no doubt cost a good deal of time and money, but developers evoke little public sympathy, due to perceptions of being greedy, swashbuckling speculators. In their defence, developers want the same thing as house hunters, more houses. And these costs and delays fall hardest on small operators, who cannot withstand the planning risks, leaving us to rely on larger developers. Others will be unsympathetic to the objectors, but in their defence, can any of us be sure that we wouldn't do the same? It is close to a universal rule in the Western world. Whenever plans are announced to build housing near an existing neighbourhood, expect to see a spontaneous outburst of concern for any number of bats, geese, birds and bees. In this case, it even extended to worries about trees growing. The phrase NIMBY, or not in my backyard, has been used to describe the phenomenon of local objections to developments, and all comes down to concentrated costs and diffuse benefits. The costs of a new development, whether it's traffic, light or noise, are concentrated on the residents of the area, whereas the benefits of the new housing are spread out among the town and the wider region. Given this, the local residents are incentivized to oppose it, while those who would move into the area are largely unaware, unmotivated and unorganized. A house hunter living elsewhere is not going to spend 2 hours at a planning meeting discussing sewerage schemes, whereas a local objector will. An American tourist visiting Killarney would have been familiar with the goings-on. In their book Neighbourhood Defenders, 3 academics from Boston University paint a revealing picture of housing objections in Massachusetts. According to the authors, people who oppose housing largely do not think they're being selfish. They believe they're community-minded neighbourhood defenders. The authors find that neighbourhood defenders are not representative of the wider area. They tend to be older and wealthier than the average and are overwhelmingly existing homeowners. The authors point to a 3-pronged strategy used by objectors: stall, shrink, and stop. If a development can't be stopped immediately, stalling is an effective tool, as the delay and the costs of endless impact assessments may cause the developer to give up, and will serve as a deterrent to others. While the development is being stalled, attempts will be made to have its height and scale reduced, and if planning permission or the local zoning plan expires, objectors can lobby to have the area dezoned. The authors find that the strength of neighbourhood defence strongly correlates with affluence, which ends up diverting new development into less affluent areas, where the residents are less politically engaged and less able to afford lawyers. As for their motives, one lawyer quoted in the book puts it succinctly: human instinct is to be adverse to change and like things the way they are, and see other people as intruding, making things more dense, more traffic, more problems. The US is the world's most comprehensive source of data and research on housing, and it's valuable not just because of its scale, but the diversity of regulations between cities. The evidence points to a strong positive relationship between regulation and house prices and a strong negative relationship between regulation and construction. In other words, more regulation means less construction and higher prices. In population terms, Ireland is comparable to a mid-sized US state, so a comparison of land use policies in some representative US states is useful. Using state to refer to both the Irish state and a US state, the comparison reveals that Ireland, California and Massachusetts are the most restrictive states, in that order. The Sunbelt states of Texas and South Carolina are the most permissive. Ireland's local governments have the least room to deviate from statewide rules. Ireland permits appeals from a wider radius of objectors than any other state. Closer to home, comparisons with Northern Ireland, Scotland and England show that Ireland has weaker local autonomy than its neighbours. And while anyone in Ireland can appeal a planning approval, in the others, only the applicant can appeal a refusal, making Ireland the most hostile to development. A link to the full country comparisons are available for Policy Patreon members. The fear in Ireland is that devolving control over land use to local governments will produce a NIMBY-friendly vetocracy, in which everyone has a veto over new development. This centralist instinct led to the creation of SHDs, which have since been discontinued, and it's what led to the creation of the 750-page planning bill and the large powers handed over to the planning regulator. But does localism automatically lead to NIMBYism? Our comparisons reveal that the US and our neighbours grant their towns and cities more local control over land use than Ireland does, yet Ireland still manages to have the most restrictive regulations. And fears of localism assume that councils would stay as they are. Right now, objectors can put pressure on councillors one by one to oppose developments. Any councillors taking a principled stance against objectors will likely lose votes, while not being compensated by would-be house hunters, who are not as interested or informed about what's going on in the shadows of planning and zoning meetings. But if Killarney had a mayor with real powers, he or she would be well aware of public opinion, and the incentives would likely point towards being pro-housing, even if it meant losing some votes among objectors. And if it were a mayor of Kerry, he or she would likely be even more pro-housing, as the objectors' influence would be more diluted. Behind the drive to centralism is a veneration of bigness, and the implication of top-down laws and agencies is that local people cannot be trusted. But is this the case? Most of the cafes in Killarney no longer sell disposable coffee cups.
So we're actually doing a changeover of our cups. We're going to phase out the paper cup.
On the back of a well-supported local initiative. And it seems unlikely that people would start thrashing the national park if left to their own devices. Kerry has a larger population than Liechtenstein, San Marino and Andorra combined, which are countries that seem to conserve their environments just fine. Allowing Kerry and its towns to handle land use policy free of dictatorial national agencies is not a radical idea, with a narrow appeals body resting at regional or national level. The Minister of Housing and Local Government, Darragh O'Brien, is of course not trying to create a housing crisis in Killarney, but if he were, he needn't veer far from current policy. Make it next to impossible to build in the countryside, putting pressure on the town. Allow his department to intervene and stop viable urban developments. Impose rent controls on Killarney despite the economic consensus against them. Incentivise landlords not to rent to locals while the town takes in large numbers. If we imagine that the government has two control dials, one for housing demand and another for supply, it seems logical that when demand is dialed up through exceptional wartime circumstances, the government should take a permissive approach on supply. This is especially the case for developments within towns, which help on climate change by reducing the need for long commutes. Of humans, that is. But Ireland's legalistic siloed government holds housing developments to an impossibly high standard, where the risk of any impact must be endlessly assessed and eliminated to the satisfaction of all the silos, no matter the duplication, the delay, or the cost. Of course, Ireland should remain sensitive to the needs of the natural world, but the impact on society of all these impact assessments requires an impact assessment. Building housing inevitably entails some impact on the natural world, just as housing newcomers does on a resident population. But we can coexist. The key questions are how to find a balance and who should be tasked with finding it. The decision in Killarney came down to balancing the competing interests of house hunters, local residents, tourism, refugees, bats, badgers and the climate, and the proper forum to balance such interests is not law, but politics. In 2002, Ireland ratified the European Charter of Local Self-Government, which states that local government should possess a wide degree of autonomy. A monitoring team recently found that Ireland remains one of the most centralised countries in Europe, citing an imbalance between the elected members and the chief executives, adding that there is still a lot to be done before local self-government in Ireland is on par with other European countries. If Kerry had a wide degree of autonomy, it might find a way to build a real home for less than the government builds a modular home, and it would likely take far greater care of its tourism industry. In recent years, at the behest of central government, the council has been clamping down on Airbnb rentals. The logic is that Airbnbs leave less property for renters, which is true in the narrow sense. But Kerry is a lowly populated western county that is heavily reliant on tourism. If left to its own devices, the county would likely adopt an abundance mindset and build enough housing for renters and tourists alike, which would have positive downstream impacts on restaurants and bars, creating more employment. However, allowing real powers to reside locally would make it easier for siloed departments to talk to one another, running the risk of common sense breaking out. If sense had prevailed 2 years ago, and this development had gone ahead, maybe the objectors would have come around by now. Maybe they'd be glad that some of their own children were able to move back to Killarney, while the new creche turned out to be a blessing, and new friends were made. In the end, the sky hadn't fallen in, the trees were still growing, and the bats were still flying.